scripture reading this morning will be coming from John chapter 8, verse 12. John 8, verse 12. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life.
Whenever Jesus said those words in John chapter 8 and verse 12, if you go back just a chapter to John chapter 7 and verse 2, the Bible says that the Jews' feast of booths, or depending on your translation, the feast of tabernacles, was at hand. The Feast of Booths was a 7-day Jewish feast. It was a 7-day Jewish festival and celebration that was celebrated at the end of their calendar year. It was celebrated whenever they would bring in the harvest of grapes and olives. It celebrated that occasion. It was one of the most popular Jewish feasts that was celebrated throughout the year in terms of people who would travel to Jerusalem in order to celebrate it. At the very beginning of the week, each Jewish family would build a temporary structure, a booth, or a tabernacle, out of sticks and leaves, and they would live inside of that for the next 7 days. It reminded them of what their forefathers did. It reminded them of what the Israelites did whenever they dwelt in temporary structures, booths or tabernacles, whenever God led them out of Egypt in the Exodus, whenever God led them through the wilderness for 40 years. It was a time of great joy. It was a time of great celebration. It was a time where a lot of different ceremonies took place throughout the week. One of the greatest and perhaps the most exciting ceremonies that took place during the Feast of Booths was called the illumination of the temple. It was a lamp lighting ceremony where the Jews would gather together in the temple. More specifically, they would gather in the court of women. And not only would each person take a flaming torch in their hand as they danced and sang praises to God throughout the night, but as you can see in the picture, there were also 4 75-foot tall oil-fed lamps that were lit every single night. Against the darkness of the night sky, the light from these lamps illuminated not only the temple, but it illuminated the entire city of Jerusalem. Some people who witnessed this, some people who were there, are recorded as saying that there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that wasn't lit up by those 4 75-foot tall lamps. That's how bright they were as they shined into the darkness of the night sky. Though the illumination of the temple ceremony reminded the Israelites of the pillar of fire that led Israel out of Egypt, that led them through the wilderness for 40 years. It's first mentioned in Exodus chapter 13, verses 21 and 22. Remember how God led His people as they wandered, led them by day by a cloud, and He led them at night by a pillar of fire. Whenever the Israelites followed that pillar of fire, they were following God. They were going in the direction that God wanted them to go. That pillar of fire gave them the light that they needed to travel at night. It casted out, it drove out the darkness that would have otherwise engulfed them. They were able to see where they were going. If you skip down to John chapter 7 and verse 37, John says that it was the last day of the feast, which was the greatest day of the feast. I mean, think about this. For 7 days now, for an entire week, the Jews have been celebrating the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles. For 7 days, they've been living in these temporary structures made out of sticks and leaves to remind them of what their forefathers did. Every night they gathered in the temple for the illumination of the temple ceremony, and they looked up at those 4 large lamps that illuminated not only the temple but the entire city of Jerusalem against the darkness of the night sky. And whenever they looked up at those 4 lamps, they were reminded of the pillar of fire. They were reminded of God's continual and abiding presence in their lives. They were reminded of the importance of following God, just like the Israelites followed the pillar of fire. It's in that context where Jesus says these words in John chapter 8 and verse 12. I am the light of the world. That's who Jesus is. He is the light of the world. He's not saying that he's the light of the temple, like those 4 great lamps that they had seen throughout the entire week. He's not saying that he's the light of Jerusalem that would only be lit up a few nights out of the year. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Just like the light from those 4 great lamps shined into the darkness of the night sky, Jesus is the light that shines into the darkness of this world. Earlier in John's Gospel, John said in John 1, verses 4 and 5, talking about Jesus, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. What does the light do? It shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Jesus says, this is who I am. I'm the light of the world. I'm the light that's shining into a world of darkness and sin and evil and brokenness and guilt. But this is not just about who Jesus is. This is also about what Jesus does. This is about what Jesus offers in verse 12. He says, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. For the entire week, the Jews have been thinking about that pillar of fire that led the Israelites out of Egypt. And how when the Israelites followed that pillar of fire, they were following God. They were going in the direction that God wanted them to go. The pillar of fire illuminated their path. It gave them the light that they needed to travel at night. It drove out the darkness that would have otherwise engulfed them. Jesus says in a similar way, whenever you follow me, just like the Israelites followed that pillar of fire that you've been thinking about all week, he says in a similar way, when you follow me, you won't walk in darkness, but you'll have not just light, you'll have the light of life. Again, earlier in John's Gospel, John 1 and verse 9, John said the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. Who is Jesus? He's the true light. What does Jesus do? He gives light to everyone coming into the world. I think some translations say he enlightens every man. Whenever we decide to follow Jesus, just like the Israelites followed the pillar of fire, we won't walk in darkness, but we'll have the light of life. Whenever we make the decision to follow Jesus, we're not going to live in the sin, the wickedness, the evil, and the brokenness of this world. But instead we'll have life. An abundant life in this one, and eternal life in the next. Jesus speaks to an audience that just celebrated the festival of booths for the last 7 days. And he says, I want you to get who I am. And I want you to get what I do, what I offer. I'm the light of the world. And whoever follows me won't walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I don't know why I would be doing this, because this would be very out of character for me. But if I was walking through the forest at night, you know who I'm going to follow? If I'm walking through a dark forest at night, I'm not just going to follow anybody. I'm going to follow the person who has the flashlight. In the midst of the darkness of that forest, I'm going to follow the person who lights the way. In the midst of the darkness of this world, we must choose to follow Jesus. In the midst of the darkness, in the sin, in the evil, and the wickedness of this world, we must make the decision that influences every other decision in our lives. The decision to follow Jesus. Isn't it awesome that who Jesus is never going to change? That's always going to remain the same. That's always going to remain constant. He has always been, he is now, and he will always be the light of the world. It's important for us to note, however, that what Jesus does in our lives depends on the decisions that we make. Who he is never going to change. But in John chapter 8 and verse 12, what he does in our lives is dependent upon the choices that we make. He says, whoever follows me, if you choose to follow me, he says, you won't walk in darkness, but you'll have the light of life. The opposite of that is also true. If we decide not to follow Jesus, if we decide to neglect Jesus or to reject Jesus, then we will walk in darkness. And we won't have the light of life. Both of those are true. The difference between walking in the darkness of this world and having the light of life that Jesus offers is making the decision to follow Him. Making one decision that impacts every other decision. I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to dedicate my life to Him. That I see where He is. I see who He is. I see what He does, and I see what He offers. Here's the direction that Jesus is going. And I'm going to make the decision to follow after Him. I want to ask you, and I want to ask me this morning, what decision are we making? I'm not asking you what decision have you made in the past. I'm not asking you, did you ever make this decision at one time? But what decision are we making now? Right now, on a daily basis, are we making the decision to follow Jesus? Or are we making the decision to reject Jesus? Because that's the difference. That one decision is the difference between living in the darkness of this world or having the light and the life that Jesus offers. Are we deciding to follow Him? Or are we deciding to reject Him? I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me won't walk in darkness, but you'll have the light of life. Whenever I was probably 8 or 9 years old, Steve McNair, which probably some of you recognize that name, some of you recognize that picture, a former quarterback of the Tennessee Titans. Whenever I was about 8 or 9 years old, Steve McNair came to my middle school. A really small, rural K-8 school. He came one Saturday, and it was such a neat experience. Apparently somebody in the school had connections with him, and so they called him, and one Saturday he came. He wasn't playing for the Titans at this point. This was at the end of his career when he was playing for the Ravens. And I remember him, all of us were sitting in the bleachers watching, and he was standing on the gym floor with our principal, and he made a speech and signed a lot of autographs. For me at that time, it was just, I was over the moon about that. I was trying to tell that story to somebody not too long ago, and they just refused to believe it. I was saying, hey, did you know Steve McNair came to visit my elementary school, just small, rural elementary school? There is no way Steve McNair came to your middle school. You're making that up. You must have dreamed that, which, okay, I've dreamed stuff and thought that it happened in real life. That's happened to me before. But I was trying to convince him it's not happening this time, that he actually came. And so we went back and forth until he ultimately said, prove it. So I did. I walked up into my room, went in the closet, grabbed the Tennessee Titans hat, showed it to him, and had Steve McNair's autograph across the bill. He still refused to believe it. Even though I gave him the proof that he asked for, even though I had proof that he was there and that I met Steve McNair, gotten his autograph, he still wasn't buying it, being really hard-headed about it. Whenever people make claims, especially when people make big claims, we want proof, don't we? When people make big claims, we say, okay, I want you to prove that. Jesus makes a pretty big claim in John chapter 8, doesn't he? About who He is and what He does. I'm the light of the world. And if you follow me, you won't walk in darkness, but you'll have the light of life. Okay, Jesus, I see what you're saying. I see the claim that you're making, but I want you to prove it. Prove to me that you're the light of the world. Prove to me that whenever I follow you, I won't walk in darkness, but I'll have the light of life. I see what you're saying. I see the claim that you're making, but right now I want you to prove it. Well, in your Bible, skip down with me to John chapter 9. John chapter 9, that's where we're going to spend the rest of our time and study this morning. I want us to realize that in John chapter 8 and verse 12, this is not just a claim that Jesus makes to the audience of the Feast of Booths. This is not just a claim that He makes that would have related to what His audience had experienced over the last 7 days. No, this is a claim that Jesus makes in chapter 8 that He proves in chapter 9. He makes the statement, makes the claim in chapter 8 and verse 12, but then demonstrates it when we go into chapter 9. Look at verse 1. As He passed by, walking down the road, He saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it's day. Night is coming when no one can work. Notice the light versus darkness theme there. We saw it in chapter 8 and verse 12. It pops up again in verse 4. He says, we have to work the works of him who sent me while it's day, while it's still light. Why? I think Jesus has a sense of urgency. He's looking forward to the death that he's going to die. He says, we have to work while it's still light because the night is coming. The darkness is coming when no man can work. You see that light versus darkness theme. And then he continues it in verse 5. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Does that sound familiar? That's what we've been talking about in John chapter 8 and verse 12, isn't it? I am the light of the world. That's the point that Jesus wants to prove in this chapter. As we read and study throughout John chapter 9, the point that Jesus wants to prove is who he is and what he does. I'm the light of the world. Okay, Jesus, prove it to me. Verse 6. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. He sends him to go wash in a pool that means sent. And so he went and washed. And the result? He came back seeing. In John chapter 9, we have a man who has never seen anything but darkness since the day that he was born. That's all that he has ever seen is darkness. Close your eyes for just a second. I'm not going to close my eyes because I don't trust you. No, I'm just kidding. I trust you. But if you close your eyes, what you're seeing, the darkness that you see when you close your eyes, is the darkness that that man saw every day of his life. That's what he saw every day. Every day since the day that he was born, all that he saw was darkness. So Jesus is walking down the road, passing by. He sees this man blind from birth. What does Jesus do? Well, what Jesus does might seem a little bit odd to us at first, but I think he does it for the benefit of this blind man. He spits on the ground. He takes the dirt and mixes it with the saliva, makes some mud, picks up the mud, spreads it on the eyes of the man who was born blind, and tells him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Go wash that off in this specific pool. You have to imagine that the blind man would have had some questions about that. That the blind man would have been a little bit confused. Because if you go to the next verse in verse 8, the Bible describes him as a beggar. Most blind people were back in the first century. It was the only way that they could supply for themselves is by begging from other people. So here's the blind man. He's on the side of the road begging for food, begging for money. Jesus and his disciples are walking down the road. All of a sudden, Jesus takes this mud, spit, saliva mix and spreads it on the eyes of this man and says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. I don't know about you, but if I was him, I would have had some questions. Jesus doesn't tell him his name. Jesus doesn't tell him where he's from. Jesus doesn't tell him who he is or what he's doing. No information. Just go wash in the pool of Siloam. Even though the blind man might have been a little bit confused, I would have been confused. When Jesus tells him to do that, he has a decision to make. Is he going to obey Jesus or disobey Jesus? Is he going to follow Jesus or reject Jesus? What does he do? Verse 7, he went, washed, came back seeing. He probably had to have someone help him get to the pool of Siloam, depending on where he was in the city of Jerusalem. But when he eventually gets there, you can picture him as he dips his head down into the pool, not knowing anything that's going on around him. He can't see anything. Dips his head down into the pool. He wipes the mud off of his eyes. He pulls his face back up out of the water. And as I'm sure we've done several times, he wipes the water from his eyes. He opens up his eyes, and for the very first time, he's able to see the world. For the very first time, he's able to look around him and see other people. He's able to look down in the water and see his own reflection. He's able to look up at the sky and see the blueness of the sky and the clouds and the sun. For the very first time in his life, the darkness fades away into light. How did that happen? He made the decision to follow the light of the world, to do what the light of the world told him to do. What does John chapter 8 and verse 12 say? I'm the light of the world, and whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Can you see how that verse very literally is played out in this man's life? How that verse is literally fulfilled in this blind man's life. He had never seen anything but darkness since the day that he was born. But he made the decision to follow Jesus. And because he made that one point as the light of the world, Jesus opens up his eyes. He drives away the darkness and replaces it with light. I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me won't walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. There's the claim. And we see that so powerfully proved and demonstrated in just the first 7 verses of this chapter. But boy, that's far from the end of this formerly blind man's story. If you continue reading, and we won't read and talk about all of this, but just as a summary, if you continue reading in verses 8 through 12, the neighbors who have seen him begging on the side of the road, they recognize him and they have some questions. And so they're asking him about what happened and who healed him, who brought sight back to his eyes. Then you go to verses 13 through 17, and he's brought before the Pharisees. And the Pharisees have very similar questions as they're in disbelief and anger and rage, particularly because this took place on the Sabbath day. And so they're angry and they're in disbelief. Well, they don't get the answers from the blind man that they want. And so in verses 18 through 23, they go to the blind man's parents. Was your son really born blind? Is this some kind of trick? Is this some kind of hoax? But they don't get anything out of the parents because the parents are afraid of the Pharisees. So again, in verses 24 through 34, they bring the blind man back into their assembly. They question him for a second time. See, if you go back to verse 22, the Pharisees made a rule that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was thrown out of the synagogue. If you were thrown out of the synagogue, that was a big deal. You're completely separated from the culture and the people and the way of life that you've always been used to. If you go to verse 34, because this blind man is defending the man who healed him, the man who brought sight to his blind eyes, even though he knows nothing about him, he defends him. And because of that, in 34, he's casted out of the synagogue. In verse 35, Jesus steps back into the story. And look at what happens. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Again, remember, this man knows nothing about Jesus. He knows nothing about the man who healed him. Never seen him because at the time he was blind. He doesn't know his name, doesn't know where he's from, doesn't know what he's about. And so when Jesus says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" he naturally responds by asking, "Who is he, sir, that I might believe in him?" Can you hear almost the eagerness in his voice? It's like he wants to believe in the Son of Man. He wants to believe in the one who caused him to see, but he just doesn't know who he is. Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. I want to trust him, but I don't know who he is. I love Jesus' response in 37. You have seen him, and it's he who's speaking to you. So in 38, he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped. Remind me of John chapter 8 and verse 12. I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me won't walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Earlier in this chapter, in the first 7 verses, the man blind from birth experiences that physically. And now in the last part of the chapter, he's experienced it spiritually. As he falls down at the feet of Jesus, confessing his belief in the Son of Man, worshiping him as the Son of Man. The darkness was driven out of his life and replaced by light in the first part of the chapter. And now the darkness has been driven out of his soul, out of his heart, out of his mind, and replaced with the light of life at the end of the chapter. Because he made the decision to follow Jesus, both physically and spiritually, this man blind from birth is no longer walking in darkness. but he has the light of life. It's the claim in chapter 8 and verse 12 and powerfully demonstrated in chapter 9. But before we move on from this, let's mention something about the Pharisees. Wish we had more time to talk about them. They're active in this text. They're in a state of disbelief. They're angry in this text. What's their problem? Look at verse 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see." He says, I've come into this world for judgment, so that those who are blind are able to see. That's the blind man. That's the man we've been talking about in John 9. He wasn't able to see physically, now he is. He wasn't able to see spiritually, now he is. He goes from calling the man a prophet to calling him sir, to calling him Lord, and saying, I believe in you, and worshiping him at his feet. He's no longer walking in darkness, but has light both physically and spiritually. Jesus came to do that. But then he says the second thing, I came into judgment. I came into this world. Number 2, that those who see may become blind. And the Pharisees take hold of that in 40. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said, are we also blind? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. Can you see the Pharisees' problem? In contrast with the blind man, they are so confident that they can see. But in reality, they're blind. They're so confident that they're in the right. But in reality, they're in the wrong. They're so confident that they're in the light. But in reality, they're in darkness. Why? Because they're not following Jesus. Because they're not making that one decision to follow him. Because they stand opposed to you. We said the opposite of this is also true. That if you choose not to follow me, you will walk in darkness. And you won't have the light of life. That's where the Pharisees are. That even though they think they're in the light, they're in darkness. Because they're refusing to follow Jesus. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me won't walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. The claim in chapter 8, powerfully demonstrated in chapter 9. Now as we close, let's think about us. Do you feel like you're living in darkness right now? Do you feel like you've allowed the darkness of this world to enter into your heart, enter into your mind? You feel like you've allowed the darkness of this world to take over your life? You don't have to look very far. You don't have to take my word for it. We live in a world of darkness, don't we? Turn on the TV. Watch the news. Scroll on social media. Look at our political climate and landscape. Look at the coronavirus and all of the destruction and death and sorrow that it's caused. And then add on top of that your own personal struggles. The trials and temptations that you deal with on a daily basis. You don't need me to tell you this. You already know it. We live in a world of darkness, don't we? If we're not careful as Christians, we allow that darkness to influence us. If we're not careful, then we allow the darkness of our world to work its way into our heart, to work its way into our mind, to take over our lives. And there's a couple different ways that looks. Maybe you feel like you're sharing in the darkness of the blind man. That I'm in darkness, I've always been in darkness, and there's nothing I can do about it. That I've tried and tried and tried, but since I can remember, darkness has defined my life, darkness has lived in my heart, I can't seem to get rid of it, and it's left me as a beggar on the side of the street. I'm in darkness, I can't shake it, and it's spiritually bankrupted me. Or maybe you're more like the Pharisees, where you're so confident that I'm in the right. I'm so confident that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm so confident that my life is where it's supposed to be. But in reality, it's not. Why? Because I'm not following Jesus. Because I'm not making that one decision that completely transforms and changes every other decision. You feel like you're in darkness right now? Have you allowed the darkness of our world, the darkness of 2020 to impact you? To live in you? Are you sharing in the darkness of the blind man or the darkness of the Pharisees? You know the only solution to that? Make the decision to to follow Jesus. That's the difference between walking in the darkness of this world and having the light of life. Making one decision that impacts every other decision. I'm going to follow Jesus. And so we asked it earlier, I want to ask it again. Are you following Jesus? Are you making that decision? Are you choosing to follow Jesus, or are you choosing to neglect Jesus? Because whenever we decide to follow Jesus, it's going to completely change us. It's going to completely transform us. For instance, when we follow Jesus for who He is, it's going to change who we are. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world in Matthew 5 and in John chapter 8 and verse 12. But then in Matthew 5 and verse 14, He says, you're the light of the world. When we follow Jesus for who He is, it changes who we are. He's the light of the world. We become the lights of the world who are reflecting His light to the darkness that surrounds us on a daily basis. When we follow Jesus for what He does, when we follow Him, we won't walk in darkness, but we'll have the light of life. When we follow Him for what He offers, it's going to change what we do. It's going to change the way that we live. In 1 John 1 and verse 7, but if we walk in the light as He's in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, His Son, cleanses us from all sin. Do you feel like you're walking in darkness right now? Do you feel like you're living in the darkness of this present age? The only solution is to follow the light. I am the light of the world, Jesus says. And if you follow me, you won't walk in darkness, but you'll have the light of life. Make that one decision that transforms every other decision as we stand and as we sing.
Have you been